Imagine being forced to just run from your home, right? And you
Yes.
finally cross an invisible line, an international border, and that line completely dictates whether you live or die from a totally preventable disease.
Right. It's it's a terrifying reality.
It really is. I mean, think about that for a second. Your biology hasn't changed at all. The cholera bacteria in the water you're drinking is exactly the same.
Yeah, the physical trauma you just escaped is exactly the same.
Exactly. But just because of where your feet landed, your legal status has completely altered your entire medical reality. So that's the stark, often pretty brutal landscape we're stepping into today. We are looking at the massive, hidden systems that govern the health of forced migrants.
And it's a landscape defined by this really
Mm.
desperate movement.
Right.
But ironically, it's governed by these incredibly rigid, stationary rules.
Right.
If we view public health through, like, a geological lens, a stable society is basically a solid tectonic plate. It gives you the economic, environmental, and political foundation for everyday life.
But then the pressure builds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When the pressure underground builds, whether that's from armed conflict or economic collapse or, an environmental disaster, the ground just gives way.
Hmm.
And the resulting tremors, which we see as human displacement, they violently fracture the very infrastructure of health.
The clinics are destroyed, the supply chains are severed.
Yeah, and the public health system has to somehow step in and act as this architectural reinforcement. It's attempting to build continuity of care directly across these active, totally unpredictable fault lines.
That visual really sets the stakes. So, welcome to the deep dive. If you're a medical student, a junior doctor, a public health trainee, or, just someone intensely curious about the intersection of geopolitics and human biology, you are in the right place.
Glad to be here for this one.
Today, we're building conceptual framework alongside Chapter 10.9 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health, which focuses on forced migrants and displaced populations.
And just a quick note for our trainees listening, this conversation is really designed to be a companion to that chapter, not a replacement for it.
Yeah, definitely read the Oxford chapter alongside this deep dive to really lock in the concepts, because our goal today isn't just to list a bunch of grim statistics. We want to understand the mechanisms.
Right. The how and the why.
Exactly. We're going to trace how displacement alters risk, how it forces extreme exposure, how that translates into clinical outcomes, and ultimately how entire health systems are forced to adapt.
And we'll follow the exact structural spine of that Oxford chapter. We really need to build this from the ground up, starting with those macro-level drivers of displacement.
The tectonic shifts.
Right. And from there, moving into the incredibly complex legal definitions that categorize these populations, and then diving into the raw epidemiological reality on the ground, both in developing host nations and in the developed world.
And finally, looking at the actual systemic public health interventions, right? Because the fundamental premise we have to keep in mind here is this. While displacement drastically alters a person's geography, their fundamental human right to health must remain constant.
It has to. That is the core of the ethical framework.
Okay, so let's unpack those macro drivers first, because I think there's a really common, almost mechanical assumption out there about why people flee.
The whole violence in, forced migration out idea.
Yeah, exactly. We tend to think violence happens, people run, a bomb drops, a family leaves. It's a very simple equation. But looking at the broader geopolitical models from the text, that simple equation seems totally inadequate for the 21st century.
It is entirely inadequate. And relying on that simplistic equation, it actually blinds us to the real structural shifts happening globally.
How so?
Well, historically, especially during the mid-20th century, displacement was largely viewed through that acute lens of interstate war or targeted political persecution. But since the end of the Cold War, and with the really aggressive acceleration of globalization, the whole landscape has mutated.
So we aren't just dealing with acute political drivers anymore.
No, we're dealing with massive chronic structural drivers.
When you say structural drivers, you're talking about the underlying economic and social architecture of a region, right? Like the North-South dynamic that sociologists like Stephen Castles have modeled.
That's exactly it. Castle's work is essential here.
I found that perspective incredibly challenging to the dominant media narrative because we constantly hear the phrase asylum crisis broadcasted in wealthy, developed nations. Like it's a crisis happening to the global north.
Right, but Castles argues that this is fundamentally a misnomer. It's actually a crisis of North-South inequalities.
Okay, break that down for me.
He argues that what the North, meaning wealthy, industrialized nations, perceives as an asylum crisis is actually just a symptom of a much deeper geopolitical imbalance. Globalization is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's integrated global markets. But on the other, it's created highly uneven playing fields.
Concentrating wealth in one area while extracting from another.
Exactly. It's concentrated wealth in the north, while often exploiting resources and labor in the south, meaning developing nations. And this economic disparity, it breeds instability, state fragility, and eventually conflict.
And the people displaced by that conflict, they aren't all heading to London or New York.
Not even close.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people displaced by this instability remain in the south. They flee to neighboring developing countries.
Wait, I really want to emphasize this point because it shatters a massive perception gap. The media often paints this picture of wealthy Western countries just being overrun by refugees.
Oh, constantly.
But the data from global health authorities shows that the burden is overwhelmingly handled by neighboring low-income nations. So wealthy nations aren't actually absorbing the biological and systemic brunt of global displacement.
No, they're mostly just experiencing the political anxiety of it.
Wow. That's a huge distinction.
It is. That is the core of the north-south disparity in forced migration. The political anxiety in the north often centers around fears of the erosion of state sovereignty, the idea that the nation cannot control its own borders.
Right.
But the actual public health burden, the absolute logistical nightmare of setting up sanitation for 100,000 fleeing people, that falls disproportionately on nations that already have incredibly fragile health infrastructures.
And the drivers forcing these people to move are just compounding, right? Sabine Apodaca's models come to mind here.
Yes, Apodaca's models highlight that severe structural human rights violations are massive predictors of displacement. When a state systematically denies its citizens basic rights or economic participation or basic security, displacement basically becomes an inevitable survival strategy.
And then you add the environmental layer, which just acts as a massive threat multiplier.
Oh, absolutely. Climate change is the great exacerbator.
Right, like if your region relies on subsistence farming and climate change turns your arable land into desert over the course of a decade, you can't feed your children.
You eventually have to move.
Yeah, like you cross a border to survive. Nobody shot at you. There is no bomb. But you are absolutely forced to leave. How does public health even begin to categorize that?
It struggles immensely. And this brings up the concept of mixed migration.
Okay, what is mixed migration?
Well, the traditional legal and humanitarian frameworks, they want to force people into a strict binary. You are either a forced migrant fleeing persecution, or you are a voluntary economic migrant seeking a better job.
Black and white.
Exactly. But mixed migration acknowledges that this binary is largely an illusion. A population might be fleeing a slow-burning economic collapse that has, subsequently resulted in localized gang violence, food insecurity, and the complete collapse of the local medical system.
So they're moving for a dozen reasons all at once.
Right. They are moving for a highly complex mixture of reasons. But our global legal systems are desperately trying to force these highly complex human survival strategies into very rigid categories.
So if the reasons people flee are getting messier and the lines between forced and voluntary are blurring, how do the border guards or the international aid agencies even know who to let in and who to help?
They rely on legal definitions. And this is where the geopolitical theory suddenly becomes an incredibly rigid clinical reality. Because the legal category a displaced person is slotted into dictates their fate.
This part of the framework really stunned me. Let's walk through these definitions because, as we established earlier, it's essentially a system of triaging human beings by their zip code and their legal paperwork, rather than their heart rate or their malnutrition levels.
It's exactly that.
Let's start with the most recognizable term, a refugee.
So the term refugee is not just a descriptive word you throw around. It is a highly specific, legally binding status anchored in the 1951 UN Refugee Convention.
The cornerstone of international protection.
Right. To be legally recognized as a refugee, an individual must meet very strict criteria. First, they must be outside their country of nationality. Second, they must be unable or unwilling to return to that country. And the reason for this inability must be a well-founded fear of being persecuted.
And it can't just be any persecution, right?
No, it's very specific. That persecution must be based on one of 5 grounds. Amongst religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion.
That is incredibly narrow.
It is. And the most crucial geographical detail, which dictates everything about their health access, is that they must have crossed an internationally recognized state border. If you do not cross a border, you cannot be a refugee under the 1951 convention.
Okay, so if I cross the border fleeing persecution based on my political opinion, I might qualify. But I don't just magically get the status the moment I step foot in the new country, right? That is where the term asylum seeker comes in.
Precisely. An asylum seeker is an individual who has crossed that border and has made a formal claim that they meet the 1951 definition of a refugee.
They've raised their hand.
Right. But their claim is still being processed by the host country's legal system. They are waiting. And that waiting period can last months or even years.
And during that time,
Their access to healthcare, employment, and social support is often heavily restricted by the host government.
now contrast that entirely with an internally displaced person, or an IDP. This is where the legal framework seems to create a massive, just fatal blind spot.
It's the most dangerous category to be in. An internally displaced person is someone who has been forced to flee their home for the exact same reasons as a refugee-armed conflict, generalized violence, massive human rights violations. But they have not crossed an internationally recognized state border.
They're still trapped inside.
They're still physically inside the territory of their home country.
I want to pause and really visualize the biology of this, because it's wild. Imagine two families living in the same village in a war zone. The village is attacked. Family A runs north, walks 10 miles, and crosses an international border. Family B runs south, walks 50 miles, but remains inside the country's borders. Biologically, they are identical. They have the same acute trauma, the same lack of clean water, the same exposure to malaria.
Exactly the same clinical profile.
But Family A, as refugees, now falls under the protective mandate of international law and the UNHCR. Family B, as IDPs, does not.
And the divergence in their clinical outcomes from that moment on is just staggering. Because a legal category dictates systemic health access.
Right.
The recognized refugee has an entire international apparatus, the UN, NGOs, massive funding designed to offer them protection, shelter, and medical care. The internally displaced person, however, relies entirely on the sovereignty of their home state to protect and provide for them.
Which is a huge problem.
It's a catastrophic problem. Because in modern conflicts, the entity bombing the village, starving the population, or actively persecuting Family B is very often their own government.
Oh, wow. So the IDP is trapped.
They are completely trapped. They are legally invisible to the international protection mechanisms because state sovereignty prevents outside agencies from crossing the border to help without the host government's permission.
Which means the government can simply deny access to international medical aid. They can effectively weaponize disease and starvation against their own displaced population.
That is exactly what happens. It is why IDPs consistently show the highest morbidity and mortality rates among all displaced groups.
That is harrowing. Let's look at another complex legal distinction the text covers: trafficked versus smuggled persons. Because these terms are often used interchangeably in the news, but clinically and legally, they represent entirely different mechanisms of movement and trauma.
The distinction hinges entirely on the nature of the crime, the element of consent, and the intended outcome.
Okay, break down smuggling first.
Smuggling is fundamentally a financial transaction for illegal entry across a border. An individual wants to cross, they pay a smuggler, and once the border is successfully crossed, the relationship usually ends.
So it's a service.
Right, an illegal one. It is legally considered a crime against the state, a violation of border integrity.
And trafficking, how is that different?
Trafficking involves coercion, fraud, abduction, or deception, and its ultimate purpose is exploitation.
Exploitation in what sense?
This could be forced labor, sexual exploitation, or even organ removal. The relationship does not end after a border is crossed. In fact, the crossing is often just the beginning of the exploitation. Trafficking is a crime against the individual.
The health implications of that difference must be massive. Like, a smuggled person might suffer injuries during a dangerous journey, but a trafficked person is subjected to chronic, ongoing physical and psychological abuse, often completely isolated from any health system.
Furthermore, because trafficking is recognized as a profound human rights violation against the individual, international protocols like the Palermo Protocol urge states to consider residency, medical support, and psychological care for victims.
But smuggled persons don't get that.
No. Smuggled persons, having committed a crime against the state's border, are typically slated for rapid detention and deportation, regardless of their health status.
And finally, circling back to what we touched on earlier, the environmental and development displaces. People whose homes are swallowed by rising sea levels, or people violently displaced by massive state-sponsored dam projects. Where do they fit in all this legalese?
Currently, they fall into a massive legal void. There is no strong, globally recognized international legal framework designed specifically for their protection if they cross a border.
Because there's no persecutor.
Exactly. They simply do not fit the 1951 Convention's criteria of individualized persecution. The climate isn't recognized as a persecutor with a political motive.
So keeping all these incredibly rigid definitions in mind, refugees, asylum seekers, IDPs, what does the actual epidemiology look like? Let's dive into the numbers and the geography to understand the scale of this. The Oxford chapter uses UNHCR data from 2011 to establish a baseline.
And establishing that baseline is critical for understanding the systemic capacity required to handle this. The sheer scale is what breaks health systems.
What were the numbers looking like?
In 2011, the UNHCR reported 42.5 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. But you have to break that massive number down by the legal definitions we just discussed to see where the real crises are hiding.
Right.
Of that 42.5 million, there were 10.4 million refugees. But there were 15.5 million internally displaced persons actively receiving UNHCR assistance.
Wait. Actively receiving assistance. That phrasing implies there are IDPs who aren't receiving assistance and aren't being counted in that 15.5 million.
Precisely. That 15.5 million only represents the IDPs that international agencies could physically reach and formally register.
Because of the sovereignty issue we talked about?
Exactly. The true global number of IDPs at that time was estimated to be much higher, closer to 26.4 million. This highlights how IDPs represent the largest, most vulnerable, and most invisible segment of the displaced population.
The textbook includes these two really vital MAPS figures, 10.9.1 and 10.9.2, mapping the geographic distribution of these populations. And going back to Castle's theory, this completely dismantles the Northern Crisis's myth.
It does. When you analyze the geographic distribution of IDP populations, the burden is intensely concentrated in the global South.
Which countries specifically?
At the time of this data, countries like Colombia, Sudan, and Iraq were carrying massive, multi-million person internal burdens. They had huge segments of their own populations internally displaced by chronic conflict and narco-violence.
And what about the refugees crossing borders? Where are they coming from, and more importantly, where are they going?
The primary producers of refugees were countries experiencing protracted systemic collapse: Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia. But the crucial data point is the host nations.
Who is taking them in?
The countries hosting the absolute highest numbers of refugees were not in Europe, and they were not in North America. They were nations like Pakistan and Iran. Right. To put the economic disparity into perspective, almost half of the world's refugees are hosted in developing countries, where the GDP per capita is less than $3,000.
That's incredible.
You have nations with incredibly limited health resources absorbing populations the size of major cities.
Which brings up a really fascinating concept the chapter introduces: the politics of numbers, based on analysis by researchers like Jeff Crisp. It makes you realize that when you see a statistic about migrant flows on the news, you can't just accept it as objective math.
You absolutely cannot.
You have to ask, who collected this data, how did they define the categories, and what are their incentives?
Epidemiology in conflict zones is never politically neutral. Statistics dictate reality.
How so?
Well, data defines how international funding is allocated, it provides political leverage, and it can be used to justify or prevent international intervention. So every actor in the system has a rationale for shaping the epidemiology.
Right, like a host country might want more aid.
Yes. A struggling host country might actively inflate the number of refugees crossing its border because a higher number guarantees a larger influx of international aid dollars and resources.
And conversely, a persecuting state has every reason to manipulate the numbers in the other direction. If a government is actively engaging in ethnic cleansing in a remote province, they will dramatically deflate the estimated number of IDPs.
Or outright deny their existence.
Right, just to avoid international scrutiny, sanctions, or a UN humanitarian intervention. The data itself is a battleground.
It really is. And this political friction around who gets counted and who gets protected makes understanding the legal framework even more critical.
Right, we touched on the 1951 convention, but the chapter details how this framework has been forced to evolve because its original form was so incredibly narrow.
It was essentially a geographically and temporally bound document. The 1951 convention was written in the direct aftermath of the Second World War.
So it was designed for Europe.
Yes, its primary purpose was to manage the massive populations of Europeans displaced by the war and the emerging Iron Curtain. It originally only applied to events occurring before January 1st, 1951, and states could choose to restrict it only to events occurring in Europe.
So if you were fleeing a brutal conflict in Africa or Asia in the 1960s, international law essentially said, sorry, you don't count.
Exactly. It was a massive failure of global equity.
Yeah.
It wasn't until the 1967 protocol that those temporal and geographic restrictions were finally removed, theoretically making the refugee definition globally applicable.
But even with those restrictions removed, the core definition requiring proof of individualized persecution still didn't match the reality of modern warfare, right?
It didn't. The nature of conflict shifted heavily in the post-colonial era and during the Cold War proxy conflicts. You saw an increase in generalized civil wars, insurgency tactics, and state collapse.
Where violence is indiscriminate.
Right. If a militia group is moving through a region, burning every village to the ground to secure territory, they aren't checking your political affiliation or your religion before they burn your house. You are fleeing generalized, indiscriminate violence.
But you couldn't prove you were individually targeted.
Exactly. So you wouldn't qualify under the strict 1951 definition.
This is where regional bodies had to step in and fix the gaps the UN left behind, right?
Yes, the regional adaptations are landmark shifts in international protection. Africa, dealing with the massive displacements of decolonization and civil wars, adopted the 1969 OAU Convention.
And Latin America did something similar.
Yes, Latin America, facing brutal Cold War-era proxy conflicts and dictatorships, adopted the 1984 Cartagena Declaration.
And what did these do?
These regional frameworks expanded the definition of a refugee. They stated that you don't just have to be individually persecuted, you can also be a refugee if you're compelled to leave your country due to external aggression, internal conflicts, or massive violations of human rights that seriously disturb public order.
That seems like a much more realistic reflection of why people actually flee. But what happens to the people who still slip through the cracks? Like, the people who arrive in a Western country, apply for asylum, and the judge says, you don't meet the 1951 criteria and you don't meet the regional criteria. The chapter discusses complementary protection. How does that work?
Complementary protection acts as the ultimate safety net, and it relies heavily on international human rights law rather than specific refugee law.
Okay.
The cornerstone of this is the principle of non-refoulement. This is the absolute, non-derogable prohibition against returning a person to a country or territory where their life or freedom would be threatened, or where there are substantial grounds for believing they would face torture.
So even if they fail the asylum test?
Even if a state legally rejects a person's formal asylum claim, if deporting them back to their home country means they will face certain torture or death, complementary protection mechanisms require the state to allow them to stay, at least temporarily.
But this brings up a really difficult systemic tension, particularly when we think back to the environmental displaces we discussed earlier.
It's a massive debate.
Because as a public health worker on the ground, you don't write international law, but you are completely bound by it when trying to provide care. If the global community decides to expand the 1951 convention to officially include climate refugees, do we risk breaking the system entirely?
It is arguably the most fiercely debated topic in forced migration law today. The 1951 convention is already under immense political attack from restrictionist governments in the global north who want to limit asylum.
So opening it up is dangerous.
Very. Advocates fear that if you open the convention up for renegotiation to include environmental displaces, these governments will use the opportunity to gut the core protections for political refugees entirely. They might water down the whole treaty.
But if we do nothing?
The counter-argument is stark. Without a legal framework, the environmental displaced has no right to cross a border, no protection from deportation, and therefore absolutely no guaranteed access to continuity of care. The legal void creates a massive, deadly public health void.
Okay, let's transition from the legal theory to the clinical reality on the ground. When the tectonic plates shift and millions of people move, where do they actually end up and what diseases are waiting for them?
The clinical reality is grim.
I want to focus on developing countries first, since that is where the vast majority, around 80% of the world's refugees are hosted. The chapter presents this incredibly sharp debate between two public health researchers, Harold Bond and Salama, about the very nature of refugee camps.
It is a fundamental clash of public health paradigms. The ethics of social integration versus the epidemiology of acute emergency response.
Let's start with Harold Bond's critique.
Harold Bond offers a fierce, devastating critique of the traditional refugee camp model. She argues that camps are essentially prison-like settlements. They forcibly restrict the freedom of movement of the refugees, they prevent them from engaging in local economies, and over time, they breed deep psychological and economic dependency.
It strips their agency.
Absolutely. Furthermore, establishing a massive parallel health system just for the refugees often drains vital medical resources, personnel, and water away from the local host populations who might be living in equal or worse poverty.
So what's your proposed solution?
For argument is that the international community should abandon the camp model entirely. We should invest those millions of humanitarian dollars into integrating refugees directly into the host communities, thereby strengthening the overall national health infrastructure for both the citizens and the refugees.
It sounds incredibly humane and logical, but then Salama provides the counterargument, which is rooted in the brutal mathematics of epidemiology.
Yes, Salama does not deny the social and psychological harms of camps. But he points out that in the acute phase of a complex emergency, when hundreds of thousands of severely traumatized, malnourished people cross a border in a matter of days, integration is logistically impossible.
The system would just collapse.
From a strictly epidemiological standpoint, camps allow for centralized, highly coordinated humanitarian health interventions. If you have a dispersed population, you cannot effectively control a cholera outbreak.
Right.
In a camp, you can rapidly map the population, set up centralized cholera treatment centers, secure a single perimeter for chlorinated water distribution, and execute mass measles vaccination campaigns in a matter of hours.
The logistics of survival basically require centralization.
Exactly. And because international aid is so highly concentrated in these specific geographic spaces, you often see a bizarre paradox.
That's the paradox.
The health metrics, like child mortality or vaccination rates inside a well-managed refugee camp, actually become significantly better than those of the surrounding impoverished host population.
That makes me think of an intensive care unit. A refugee camp is essentially a massive geopolitical ICU.
Well, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. It's highly resourced, it is designed for an acute crisis, you have specialists everywhere, and it is the absolute best place to be if you are coding and need your life saved immediately. But an ICU is a terrible, degrading place to live for 10 years.
It destroys your autonomy.
Exactly. It's a terrible environment for long-term health and human dignity.
That is a remarkably accurate analogy. The camp is engineered to stop death, not to promote a flourishing life. And to understand what it takes to stop that death in the ICU, we have to look at the clinical metrics.
Let's get into the metrics.
In complex emergencies, public health officials rely on the crude mortality rate, or CMR. It is the ultimate baseline indicator of crisis severity.
What's the threshold for a crisis?
The emergency threshold, the point at which a situation is officially classified as an acute humanitarian crisis, is defined as greater than 1 death per 10,000 people per day. In catastrophic historical crises, we have seen CMR spike to 30 or even 40 times the baseline rate.
So what is actually killing people at that massive scale? Let's walk through the specific clinical threats the chapter outlines, starting with the absolute apex predator of the acute phase, diarrheal disease.
Historically and consistently, diarrheal diseases, specifically cholera and Shigella dysentery, are the mass killers in the early days of displacement. The sheer density of human beings, combined with the sudden lack of sanitation infrastructure, creates an explosive epidemiological environment.
The chapter references Goma, right?
Yes, the catastrophic 1994 crisis in Goma, Zaire, which is a foundational case study in humanitarian medicine. Following the Rwandan genocide, roughly 800,000 refugees flooded across the border into Goma in a matter of days.
800,000 people. You can't even comprehend the logistical nightmare of that.
It was unprecedented, and the geography was unforgiving. Goma is situated on volcanic rock, which made it virtually impossible to rapidly dig latrines.
So where did they get water?
The population was forced to rely on Lake Kivu for drinking water. Within days, the lake became massively contaminated with human feces. A cholera outbreak erupted, followed almost immediately by Shigella. In just a few weeks, 50,000 people died.
50,000 people.
And public health surveillance indicated that 85% of those 50,000 deaths were due exclusively to diarrheal disease.
It's just a terrifying mechanism.
It is. The bacteria causes massive, rapid fluid loss, and without aggressive oral or intravenous rehydration, a patient can die of hypovolemic shock in hours. Overcrowding, lack of soap, inadequate sanitation, and contaminated water are a lethal combination.
The next major threat the chapter highlights is measles. And what struck me here was the biological synergy it has with malnutrition. We usually think of measles as a rash and a fever, something we vaccinate against in childhood and don't worry much about. But in a displacement camp, it is a monster.
It is. This is a classic example of compounding systemic vulnerabilities. A healthy, well-nourished child who contracts measles will typically mount an immune response, clear the virus, and recover.
Right.
But a child who has been fleeing conflict for weeks is likely severely malnourished. Malnutrition, particularly vitamin A deficiency, aggressively degrades the immune system's ability to maintain the integrity of mucosal linings, like the respiratory tract and the gut.
So the barriers are down.
Exactly. The measles virus attacks these weakened linings, so the malnutrition allows the measles to run rampant, causing severe pneumonia or severe diarrhea. In turn, the measles virus further strips the body of its remaining nutrients, drastically worsening the malnutrition.
It's a rapid downward spiral.
It is. In crowded camp settings among malnourished populations, the case fatality rate for measles can skyrocket from a fraction of a percent to as high as 30%.
Which completely explains why, when reading about humanitarian logistics, establishing a mass measles vaccination campaign for children under 15 is always listed as the absolute first-line, day-one primary intervention. It's running concurrently with securing clean water.
It is the most effective way to immediately slash pediatric mortality.
The chapter also details the risks of malaria and acute respiratory infections, or ARIs. How does displacement alter the mechanics of these diseases?
With malaria, displacement often forces populations to move from areas of low malaria endemicity, meaning they have little to no acquired immunity, into highly endemic jungle or swamp regions.
And the camps themselves are a risk.
Yes, the physical reality of a camp increases vector exposure. You have tens of thousands of people sleeping outside or under thin plastic sheeting, drastically increasing the number of mosquito bites.
And what about ARI?
Similarly, ARIs like pneumonia spread like wildfire, not necessarily because of a novel pathogen, but because of the environment. Severe overcrowding in poorly ventilated tents, exposure to freezing nighttime temperatures, and smoke inhalation from indoor cooking fires just decimate respiratory health.
And we also have to look at diseases like tuberculosis, meningococcal disease, and hepatitis E. The TB issue seems particularly tied to the disruption of the health system itself.
Precisely. Tuberculosis requires a strict, continuous 6-month regimen of antibiotics. If a patient is 2 months into their treatment and their village is attacked, forcing them to flee, their treatment is interrupted.
And the bacteria rebounds.
The disease rebounds and the bacteria mutates, leading to a massive spike in multi-drug-resistant TB, which is incredibly difficult and expensive to treat even in a stable developed nation, let alone a refugee camp.
Right. Meningococcal disease makes sense, too, with the overcrowding.
Yes, particularly in the African meningitis belt, simply because the bacteria thrives in overcrowded, dusty environments where people are living in close proximity.
But hepatitis E, I know it's a waterborne virus, but the chapter notes it has a uniquely terrifying profile in these settings.
Hepatitis E spreads via the fecal-oral route, very similar to cholera. In a general population, it usually causes a self-limiting illness. But for reasons that are still not entirely understood pathophysiologically, hepatitis E is exceptionally lethal to pregnant women.
Oh, lethal.
In the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of a displacement camp, an outbreak of hepatitis E can result in a maternal mortality rate of up to 20%.
Which transitions perfectly into the broader issue of reproductive health. The chapter mentions a protocol called the Minimum Initial Service Package, or MISP. Why was this necessary to develop?
For decades, humanitarian emergency responses suffered from a massive blind spot. They treated reproductive health as a secondary, long-term development issue rather than an acute emergency need.
Like it could wait until the camp was stabilized.
Right. But biology doesn't pause for geopolitics. Pregnancy doesn't stop during a war. Women in displacement face horrific, magnified vulnerabilities. They lack access to emergency obstetric care, leading to massive spikes in maternal mortality from hemorrhage or obstructed labor. They lose access to family planning.
And the violence.
Yes, fundamentally, the chaos and breakdown of social order lead to drastically increased rates of sexual and gender-based violence, which is often weaponized by armed groups.
So the MISP is designed to force a change in priorities.
Yes. The Minimum Initial Service Package is a standardized set of life-saving interventions that must be implemented from the very onset of an emergency. It dictates that preventing maternal death, providing emergency contraception, managing the clinical consequences of rape, and preventing HIV transmission are acute, life-saving priorities.
Day one stuff.
They must be funded and executed on day one, right alongside cholera treatment and water distribution. It cannot be an afterthought.
Now, we've discussed all of these terrifying clinical threats, cholera, measles, malnutrition, mostly within the context of refugee camps, which we liken to an ICU. But we need to remember the legal definitions we built earlier. What happens to the internally displaced persons, the IDPs, who don't have access to the ICU?
The clinical reality for IDPs is often catastrophic. Because they lack the centralized aid infrastructure of UNHCR refugee camps, and because international agencies are often legally or physically blocked by the host government from reaching them, IDPs suffer immensely.
They're completely exposed.
They are exposed to all the same pathogens and violence, but with zero architectural reinforcement from a public health system.
The textbook cites a horrifying example of this from Sudan.
Yes, the 1998 crisis in Ajib, Sudan. It was an IDP population completely cut off from sustained aid. Public health assessments recorded a severe acute malnutrition rate of 36%.
Wow, 36%.
To put that in perspective, a severe acute malnutrition rate of 2% is considered a serious public health emergency. 36% indicates a total systemic collapse of survival mechanisms. People were simply starving to death because the geopolitical barriers prevented the logistics of aid from reaching them.
Okay, we need to shift our focus now. We've looked extensively at the developing world, where the vast majority of displacement occurs. Let's look at the global north. What is the clinical reality for the forced migrants who actually survived the journey and managed to reach developed nations?
The Oxford chapter approaches this using a very useful framework developed by Gushalak and McPherson. They break the migrant experience into three distinct phases: pre-departure, the migratory journey itself, and arrival.
Makes sense.
The critical insight here is that each phase imprints differently on the individual's biology and psychology. By the time a refugee arrives in a developed nation, their disease profile has shifted significantly from the acute infectious threats we saw in the border camps.
Right. When a migrant arrives at a Western border, the host nation's health system is highly focused on screening for infectious diseases. Things like active tuberculosis, hepatitis B and C, or parasitic infections like strongyloidiasis.
Because they're protecting their own borders.
Exactly. But while the border guards are looking for infectious threats, the actual burden of disease the patient is carrying is much wider and often much more chronic.
The host country's primary concern during arrival screening is usually public health security, protecting its own domestic population from imported pathogens. But the migrant is often suffering heavily from chronic, non-communicable diseases that have gone completely untreated for years due to the collapse of their home health system.
Like what kind of diseases?
We see massive spikes in unmanaged diabetes, severe hypertension, and profound nutritional deficits. For example, a refugee who spent 2 years hiding in a basement or living in a covered transit camp will likely present with severe vitamin D deficiency, which impacts bone health and immune function.
And trauma from the journey itself.
Yes, there is often complex, untreated trauma from sexual violence or torture sustained during the migratory journey, which is often reliant on smugglers and highly dangerous routes.
But the deepest dive the chapter takes in this section, and arguably the most profound public health challenge for host nations, is into mental health. The psychological toll of displacement is staggering.
The epidemiological data is deeply sobering. Meta-analyses of displaced populations settling in Western countries suggest that approximately 1 in 10 refugees suffer from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and roughly 1 in 20 suffer from major depression.
That is exponentially higher than the baseline of the surrounding host population.
It is.
And what I found so compelling about the chapter's analysis is that this trauma isn't just a lingering echo of the war they fled. The trauma is actively being generated by their current environment.
Yes. The chapter explicitly identifies the domestic policies of the host countries themselves as major negative social determinants of mental health. It specifically analyzes policies implemented in nations like the UK and Australia.
Let's puzzle through this. We often assume that once a refugee reaches a safe, wealthy country, the trauma stops and the healing begins. But the administrative processes seem to inflict their own specific type of psychological violence.
Consider the psychological mechanism of seeking asylum. You have fled a life-threatening situation. You arrive, but instead of being granted immediate safety, you are placed in a prolonged mandatory detention center while your claim is processed.
Like a prison.
You are surrounded by guards, your movement is restricted, and you have no idea when or if you will be released. For a survivor of torture or arbitrary imprisonment, this environment is intensely triggering. It replicates the exact trauma they fled.
And even if they are released into the community, they are often placed on temporary protection visas. How does that specific legal status impact mental health?
A temporary visa creates a state of perpetual psychological limbo. Recovery from trauma requires a foundation of safety and predictability. If your visa must be renewed every 3 years, and there's a constant looming administrative threat that you could be deported back to the country that tortured you, your nervous system can never truly downregulate.
You can't plan a future.
You cannot plan for a career, you cannot confidently build a life, because the ground beneath you could be legislatively pulled away at any moment. This chronic hypervigilance leads to sustained high cortisol levels, massive allostatic load, and the severe exacerbation of PTSD and depressive symptoms. The policy itself is pathogenic.
This brings us to a massive ethical collision in the field. If we look at public health surveillance like mandatory health screenings at the border as an early warning radar system, we see nations deploying it primarily to protect their own borders. A country screens a newly arrived asylum seeker for tuberculosis to ensure it doesn't enter the general population. But what happens when that asylum seeker tests positive and their asylum claim is simultaneously rejected? Are they treated as a patient in need of care? Or are they deported as a biological and legal threat?
That scenario is where epidemiology crashes headfirst into medical ethics. The chapter highlights this intense tension. Governments, generally speaking, operate on a public health framework heavily focused on risk management and border security. Their priority is protecting the host nation.
But the doctors.
Medical professionals are bound by a human rights framework and medical ethics. The fundamental belief that a patient has a right to health and medical care regardless of their visa status or nationality.
And when policies dictate that failed asylum seekers are denied access to the National Health Service or are charged exorbitant, unpayable fees for basic hospital access, it places clinicians in an impossible bind. The state is demanding that the doctor act as a border guard, denying care to a sick human being, which conflicts directly with their Hippocratic oath and duty of care.
It forces the health system to become complicit in the structural violence against the migrant.
So, recognizing all these massive systemic failures, from the deadly outbreaks in camps to the ethical binds in Western hospitals, how do we actually engineer better systems? This brings us to the evolution of public health interventions. We've learned a lot of very hard, very bloody lessons over the last few decades.
The modern discipline of emergency public health is relatively young. It really only started taking a formalized shape in the 1970s, dealing with crises in Biafra and Cambodia. But the ultimate catalyst for systemic paradigm-shifting change was the 1994 Goma crisis we discussed earlier.
Because the failure was so absolute.
Yes, the sheer scale of preventable deaths in Goma, the failure of the massive, well-funded international community to provide enough clean water and effectively manage a predictable cholera outbreak. It triggered profound outrage and intense soul-searching within the humanitarian sector. Agencies realized that good intentions were not enough. They needed rigorous, quantifiable standards of care.
The chapter mentions that this catastrophic failure led to the joint evaluation of emergency assistance to Rwanda, which in turn birthed the SPHERE project. What exactly is SPHERE, and how does it change the reality on the ground?
The SPHERE project established a set of universal, minimum, evidence-based standards for humanitarian response. Before SPHERE, an NGO might set up a camp and report back to their donors, "We provided water."
Which means nothing.
It is clinically meaningless. How much water? Was it chlorinated? How far did people have to walk to get it? SPHERE created quantifiable accountability. It engineered quality control into the chaos of a war zone.
What do those standards look like in practice? Give me an example.
They are highly specific. For example, the SPHERE standard dictates that a minimum of 15 liters of water per person per day must be provided for drinking, cooking, and hygiene. It states that a maximum of 250 people should share a single water tap and that a latrine must be located at least 30 meters away from any groundwater source to prevent the exact type of fecal contamination that devastated Goma.
Wow, so it's incredibly precise.
It is. It specifies the exact kilocalorie requirements of a daily food ration based on the demographic breakdown of the population. It turns emergency aid from an act of charity into a measurable, standardized medical intervention.
The chapter also applies a classic epidemiological model tool and Waldman's prevention framework to the geopolitical chaos of complex emergencies. Can we break that down? Primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. I want to understand how a public health doctor views a war.
It is a brilliant way to map traditional disease prevention onto geopolitics. Primary prevention in a clinical setting is a vaccine. In a complex emergency, primary prevention is upstream geopolitical engineering.
Right, diplomacy.
Exactly. It is international diplomacy, conflict resolution, equitable trade policies, and human rights enforcement designed to prevent the conflict from happening or escalating in the first place. If you prevent the violence, you prevent the displacement, and you entirely prevent the subsequent health crisis.
But if primary prevention fails and the violence starts, we move to secondary prevention.
Secondary prevention is all about early detection and rapid response. It is having robust surveillance systems in place that detect early population movements. It's contingency planning. So when the geopolitical radar shows that 800,000 people are likely to cross a border next week, the IV fluids, the cholera cots, the epidemiologists, and the logistical frameworks are already staged at the border, ready to deploy instantly.
You mitigate the impact.
You mitigate the impact of the displacement.
Which leaves tertiary prevention.
Tertiary prevention is the actual clinical and environmental response once the crisis has fully occurred and the population is displaced. This is the execution of the SVHIR standards. It is the provision of clean water, sanitation, therapeutic feeding centers for severe acute malnutrition, and massive epidemic preparedness. It is managing the morbidity and mortality to ensure the crisis doesn't spiral into total collapse.
But the chapter notes a major evolutionary shift in the field. Mortality rates inside those centralized UNHCR-run camps are generally going down because we've gotten much better at executing those SPEAR standards. But the new frontier, the massive blind spot, is the people outside the camps.
Exactly. The vast majority of displaced people today do not live in camps. The great operational challenge of the 21st century is reaching the non-camp refugees who have integrated into sprawling urban slums and the millions of invisible IDPs hiding in remote rural areas.
It's like we figured out how to build the perfect, highly efficient emergency room inside the camp, but the patients are scattered all over the city, hiding in the shadows, and they legally or physically cannot get to the ER.
That is exactly the limitation of the current paradigm. Our systems are geographically bound, but the vulnerable populations are dispersed and hidden. Addressing this requires moving beyond just logistics and water pipes. It requires looking at the final themes of the chapter: ethics, voice, and agency.
The chapter notes that major top-down global frameworks like the Millennium Development Goals largely failed marginalized groups like forced migrants. Why did those massive, well-intentioned global pushes miss the mark?
Because they didn't focus enough on equity and disaggregated data. When the UN sets a broad national target for health improvement like reducing overall maternal mortality by 50%, a country can meet that target by aggressively improving the health of its wealthy and middle-class citizens living in the capital city.
And just ignore everyone else.
They can completely ignore or even actively oppress the displaced minority populations suffering in the border regions, and the national average still looks like a massive success. Averages hide massive inequities. If you don't specifically target the most vulnerable, systemic frameworks will naturally leave them behind.
This section also tackles a really fascinating issue: research ethics. When public health academics or medical teams go into a refugee camp to study these populations, there is a massive danger of doing harm, even unintentionally.
You have to consider the profound power imbalance. An academic researcher flies in with institutional funding, multiple passports, and guaranteed physical safety to study people who have lost absolutely everything and have zero legal protection.
Right.
If a researcher conducts interviews and inadvertently exposes a community's hidden survival strategies, or fails to rigorously protect their anonymity in a published paper, they could literally be providing a roadmap for persecutors or hostile host governments to further target that community.
The stakes are literally life and death.
They are. The chapter argues that the fundamental ethical mandate in forced migration public health is to shift the locus of power away from the Western institutions and back to the displaced community itself.
The text uses a really powerful case study from the Thai-Burmese border to illustrate what that actually looks like in practice.
It is a phenomenal example of ethical reengineering. Instead of Western academics flying in to do extractive research on the refugees, they partnered with local displaced Karen women's groups.
And what did the women's groups do?
These displaced women took control of the entire epidemiological process. They decided what health questions were actually important to ask their own community. Focusing heavily on maternal health and practical survival, they collected the data themselves, and the academics had to get their permission to publish it.
Wow.
It shifted the entire model from research on a passive subject to research with and research by an empowered community.
Which perfectly highlights the final and perhaps most important theme of our whole discussion, agency. We are constantly bombarded with this pervasive, highly manipulative media narrative of the helpless, tragic victim. But the public health evidence challenges that aggressively.
We must completely discard the helpless victim narrative. Forced migrants are individuals exercising profound agency and resilience. They are making highly rational, intensely calculated survival choices every single day in utterly chaotic, dangerous environments.
Give me an example of that agency.
If a refugee community refuses to use a newly built, clean health clinic, it isn't out of ignorance or backwardness. It is almost certainly because they recognize a risk that the foreign health worker doesn't see. Perhaps the clinic is located in an area where they are vulnerable to police harassment or deportation. They are actively navigating risk. They must have a central voice in designing the public health solutions meant for them.
It really makes you reevaluate your role as a practitioner. How do you avoid the trap of medical paternalism? You have to fundamentally move from treating a population as a passive biological vessel to partnering with them as experts in their own survival. You have to recognize and build upon their resilience, not just document their trauma.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective from paternalism to partnership is just as critical to the long-term success of a health intervention as delivering clean water.
We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started with the macroeconomics of globalization. We waded through the incredibly rigid, life-altering legal definitions of the 1951 Convention. We visualized the brutal epidemiology of cholera and measles in the camps. And we analyzed the hidden psychological toll of detention and temporary visas in the developed world.
We have spent this entire deep dive discussing how displacement shatters continuity of care, specifically because our health systems are inherently rooted in geography. A citizen has a clinic in their town, their medical records are in a filing cabinet or a localized server. When they are forced to lose their geography, they lose their health identity and their health rights.
Yeah.
But I want to leave everyone listening with a speculative thought to mull over, especially as technology advances.
Yeah.
We live in an era of highly secure digital networks, of biometrics, of global mobile technology. What if, in the future, citizenship and health records were completely decoupled from physical borders?
Oh, that's fascinating.
What is the future of public health for forced migrants isn't just about building a more efficient refugee camp, but about engineering a truly portable, borderless digital health identity. An identity that travels with the patient, guaranteeing their medical history and their right to care no matter what tectonic plates shift beneath their feet.
That is a profound paradigm shift. Imagine a world where your right to health doesn't stop at a border checkpoint. Now, to help lock in all the critical frameworks we've built today for our trainees, let's transition to our rapid recall prompts. I'll read the question, I will pause briefly, and then the expert will give the answer and point to the specific section of the chapter for review. Let's begin. Question 1. Which category of forced migrant is defined by international law as someone fleeing individualized persecution across an internationally recognized border?
Refugee. You should review the Categories of Forced Migrants section of the Oxford chapter to consolidate the specific legal criteria of the 1951 Convention.
Question 2. In the acute phase of a complex emergency, what is historically the most common cause of mass mortality in refugee camps in developing nations?
Diarrheal diseases, specifically cholera and Shigella dysentery. Review the Causes of Death subsection under the Developing Countries portion of the chapter.
Question 3. What specific legal instrument expanded the 1951 Convention definition of a refugee in Africa to include individuals fleeing external aggression and generalized violence?
The 1969 OAU Convention. Review the legal framework section for the distinctions between the 1951 Convention, the OAU, and the Cartagena Declaration.
Question 4. Epidemiologically, why are internally displaced persons generally at a significantly higher risk of severe morbidity and mortality than registered refugees in camp settings?
Because they lack international legal protection mandates and often have severely restricted access to centralized humanitarian health assistance due to state sovereignty barriers. Review the internally displaced persons subsection.
Question 5. Which catastrophic 1994 humanitarian crisis acted as the primary catalyst for the development of rigorous quality and accountability standards like the SPARE project?
The massive Rwandan refugee influx into Goma, Zaire. Review the Public Health Solutions and Intervention section to understand the shift towards standardized emergency response.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the geopolitical systems behind the clinical statistics, and we will catch you next time. Here are the details of this episode.
Forced migrants. Title: Forced Migrants. Byline: Medlock Holmes investigates displacement through the lens of public health, tracing how conflict, persecution, disaster, and instability reshaped exposure, vulnerability, and access to care. Episode description: Forced migration, including refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons, represents one of the defining humanitarian and public health challenges of our time. Conflict, political persecution, environmental disaster, and structural instability displace millions globally. This chapter explores the epidemiology of displacement, including infectious disease risk, malnutrition, maternal health challenges, interrupted vaccination, mental health trauma, and barriers to healthcare access. It examines legal frameworks, humanitarian protection mechanisms, and the responsibilities of host systems. Forced migration is framed not only as crisis response, but as structural adaptation. Public health must integrate cultural competence, continuity of care, trauma-informed systems, and equitable policy to safeguard displaced populations. Displacement alters geography, but health rights must remain constant. Key takeaways: Forced migration increases exposure to infectious disease, malnutrition, and trauma. Mental health burden is substantial among displaced populations. Access to healthcare is often fragmented by legal and structural barriers. Maternal and child health vulnerabilities are amplified in displacement settings. Humanitarian coordination and international law shape response capacity. Trauma-informed, culturally competent care improves outcomes. Public health systems must ensure continuity and equity in displacement contexts.